Okay, hopefully everybody can hear me. Good morning. My name is Amy DeCook. I'm in-house legal counsel for the North Dakota School Boards Association. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Today we are doing having a discussion about the role of school board presidents. I would say that it's kind of a constant flow of questions from not only board presidents, but other board members, as well as administrators and business managers about, the role of the school board president in various situations. And so we thought it would be a good time to cover this. We are, I really want this to be as much of a discussion as possible, even over Zoom. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the discussion today. You can do that by using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Try to put all questions in there because it'll be easier for us to manage that. If you have any technical questions, if if can't see my screen, or if you can't hear me, use the chat feature, and Taylor, who's watching as well, is going to monitor that. So if there's any technical difficulties, use the chat feature as well. If you get kicked off and can't join back in, you can just give our office a call, and we'll try to get you back in. I'm pleased to see that we have a number of participants today. We did change the time for our lunch and learn to 9 a.m. We're going to try this time out this month and next month to see how you guys like it and see if that seems to work easiest for you guys. So any feedback on that would be welcomed as well. Okay, so without further ado, I just wanted to kind of start talking a little bit about just an overview of the role and responsibilities of a school board president. So there is some mention about the school board president and their duties in North Dakota law. Specifically, there is the requirement that at the annual meeting, the school board members should elect amongst themselves a board president to serve for a one-year term. So that is a requirement. Every board needs to elect a school board president. It also allows for a vice president to be elected to serve in the absence of a school board president, but you are not required to elect a vice president. We highly recommend you do so in the event that the school board president is not available to serve at a particular meeting. Oh, are you guys having trouble hearing? Let me just, looks like we're having some issues in the chat. Give me a second. Can everybody else hear? Okay, looks like we're, all right, perfect. Sorry about that interruption. Okay, so that's the kind of the basis for appointing a school board president in North Dakota law. In addition to that, the North Dakota law also details a couple of specific statutory duties of a board president. Specifically, the board president is tasked with presiding over all meetings of the board. In addition, by statute, the board president is charged with appointing committees subject to board approval. So what that means is that, if the board has a couple of standing committees or has created a special committee for a particular purpose or task, typically, not only does North Dakota law allow for the board president to appoint the committee members, but also that's echoed in many school board policies. But ultimately, the committee appointments must be approved by the board. So the board president chooses or nominates the committee members, and then the board ultimately approves that. In addition, statutorily, the board president is required to authorize the issuance of all negotiable instruments for payment of bills. So basically that means, if it has the power to authorize issuance of checks to pay the expenses of the school district. Typically, checks are signed by the board president as well as the business manager. It's just a check and balance in terms of handling of school district funds. That's pretty standard by board policy. And then there's also kind of this catch-all provision in North Dakota law that the board president is required to perform all other acts as required by law. And really what that's referring to is, as you may know, and hopefully know, that there are kind of a myriad of other responsibilities that are mentioned specifically in law in terms of what the board president is required to do. I'm not going to go through all of those today, but there's a number of examples where the board president is mentioned specifically in law as being required or being responsible or being authorized to do something on behalf of the board. Okay, so in addition to those statutory duties that are mentioned specifically in North Dakota Century Code, most boards adopt a policy that talks about officers of the board, including the school board president. And that policy often delineates additional duties that are in addition to the ones mentioned in North Dakota law specifically. Most districts have our template policies. The template policy I'm referring to is BBBA. And these are the list of powers that our template policy lists. So for example, the board president is charged with preparing an agenda in advance of each meeting in accordance with policy. Most boards also have a policy on pre-meeting procedures and creating the agenda. That policy and those policies echo that it's the board president in consultation with and with the assistance of the superintendent creates each agenda for each meeting. In addition to that, and we'll get into meeting procedures in a little bit more detail in a bit, but that's one power that policy grants to the school board president. In addition, the school board president is authorized and expected to serve as the official spokesperson for the board, or oftentimes the board president will appoint another spokesperson to speak on behalf of the board in communications with the media or sometimes with the public. Even though there's this board policy that delegates that responsibility to serve as the official spokesperson for the board, we encourage board presidents to, if there's a particular situation occurring in your district, especially if it's getting a lot of media attention or if the community is really, kind of interested in a particular situation or issue, have the board kind of discuss and determine the message of the board and then delegate the board president to go out and speak on behalf of the board. Another very common practice is to have the superintendent be the spokesperson of the district as well, oftentimes getting direction from the board president and or the full board. When the board is not in session and an emergency matter arises, policy dictates that the board president has the authority to take any immediate action that is required in order to deal with the emergency situation, but it is expected that as soon as possible, the board president will come back and report to the board and seek any additional or make any additional recommendations for action to respond to whatever the emergency matter is or emergency situation. And then there's this kind of catch-all abstract power to do, to provide necessary leadership to keep the board acting as cohesively as possible. And so that's really, I think, kind of the real work of a board president sometimes is to try to build consensus among board members, and that happens at meetings, but it also happens outside of the board meeting room as well. A lot of times board members are reaching out to the board president for with concerns or to discuss issues that might be coming up at a board meeting or might be happening in your district. And so the board president is really tasked by the board explicitly through policy to help achieve cohesiveness as much as possible on the board. So that's kind of what that power means. And then finally, to be available for counsel to the district administrator. And what that really is referring to is, you know, the superintendent or your lead administrator in your district, you know, it's really important for the board president and the administrator to have a very good working relationship, because the superintendent should be reaching out to the board president as necessary to kind of gauge the board's response on issues, or to get, you know, some feedback, informal feedback on issues that arise during the operation of the district. And so the board president needs to be available to provide that, you know, counsel or that feedback to the district administrator on a regular basis. So these are kind of the general delineated powers that you'll see in addition to the statutory duties that are reflected in policy. All right. So kind of keeping this in mind, when you're choosing a board president at your annual meeting each year, you'll want to keep all of these duties and responsibilities in mind in making sure that you're choosing the right board member to serve in that leadership capacity. And these are kind of some of the things to keep in mind in addition to those statutory and policy responsibilities. You know, you really want, we kind of think as board members, as leaders of the community anyways, that's kind of the type of folks that typically run for school boards, which is great. But so you're already dealing with people that show leadership skills or that are willing to lead in your communities, but your board president is really the person that you choose should be the kind of the leader among the leaders. The board president truly is a leader of the district and a leader of the board in many respects. And so you want to choose somebody that kind of exhibits that those leadership skills. You know, there's a lot of responsibility and a big role that the board president plays in a number of situations. So you have to be a capable facilitator, facilitating good, robust discussion at board meetings, facilitating communication with your administrative staff, being a skillful negotiator, because oftentimes board presidents are going to be responsible or going to play a role in resolving conflicts, sometimes informally and formally, depending on the situation. So being kind of a good negotiator. And then I think even most importantly, being a very good listener and being kind of a sounding board as issues come up, and being able to really understand you know, the situation and to provide good feedback. Board presidents should be comfortable with public speaking, including being recorded and being quoted in the newspaper and in other media outlets. That is pretty common. So, you know, keeping that in mind when you're choosing your board president is important. You know, being a board president also takes a big time commitment and managing kind of a lot of things and a lot of balls in the air, so to speak. And so having good organizational skills and time management skills are important as well. And then kind of the big task, understanding all of the various open meetings requirements and how they work in reality, and really being responsible for knowing, for the most part, all of the policies and procedures that you've adopted as a board, which can be kind of a hefty task. We expect and hope that all board members have knowledge of these areas, open meetings requirements, and various board policies and procedures, because everyone is expected to follow and comply with open meetings requirements and the policies and procedures that you adopt. But it's even more important for the board president, because you're kind of responsible in a way to making sure that not only you do it as an individual board member, but that your board as a whole is complying with all of those requirements. We have a question. Do I recommend the board president to notify the rest of the board if there is complaint or investigation occurring against the business manager or superintendent? Great question. It kind of depends. I know that's kind of a lawyer answered, but it does really depend. I would say overall, I don't think it's a bad idea to let the board know if you have a complaint against the superintendent or business manager. Those are the only two employees that report directly to the board and are supervised directly by the board. And when there is a complaint, it's quite common and typically dictated by policy that the board president is the one that's going to be tasked with handling or reviewing or investigating any kind of complaint regarding those two employees. But ultimately, the board president isn't going to determine what corrective action, if any, needs to be done as in response to that complaint. And so the board president is going to have to go to the board and make a recommendation, and then the board will vote on it. So it's always good, I think, not to be caught off guard as a board that there's a complaint and that now all of a sudden you have to act on it. So I do think it's a good thing to give a heads up that to the rest of the board, hey, just want to let you know I've received a complaint against the business manager or superintendent. I'm going to handle it per board policy in terms of investigating and reviewing and gathering information. And I will make any, I'll come to the board with any proposed corrective action or recommendation for response. That's probably about all that I would recommend. Because, especially if they're personnel matters, you might be bringing a recommendation for discharge or non-renewal to the board. And so you want to make sure you're not, giving all of the details up front, but just giving a heads up that, hey, we've got a complaint's been filed. And so I'm going to, handle it per board policy. That's kind of the general answer I would give. There might be a caveat or two to that depending on the situation, but that's my general response. Good question. So there's another question in the chat about from a business manager, whether a husband and wife can both be on the board. There's nothing in North Dakota law that would prohibit a husband and wife or two spouses from being on the same board at the same time. Frankly, I don't even really know if that would create any real conflicts of interest under North Dakota law. I guess it would kind of depend, but just by virtue of being married to each other, that wouldn't present necessarily a legal problem. I think where it could become a problem is, are you acting in the best interests of the district and of the students? Are you teaming up a lot to, kind of push a personal agenda? I think that's where I would get a little concerned about, two spouses being on the same board. I think in that situation, the board president, would be tasked with making sure there's not kind of, improper motivations, pushing, board action, but really there's not a lot, anything really formal you can do about it. If they are, qualified electors in the district, they typically can be elected to the board. So that's a unique situation. I've never run into that. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. I know of one district, I think, where there was a husband and wife on the same board at the same time. And I don't remember that being particularly a particular problem for that district, but it's an interesting situation nonetheless. Okay. So what I want to spend most of the time on today is calling and conducting board meetings, because that's, a huge part of what board presidents do. It's also, I think, one of most of the questions that I get about board president duties, kind of circle around board meetings. So in terms of the various meetings and the power to call a meeting, so the annual meeting is required by law. It has to be held in July each year. The law does specify that the board president pick a date for the July meeting. So that's something unique. I would say that in most districts, the annual meeting is held pretty much the same time each year in July. So I don't really know how much thought the board president really takes in terms of picking an actual date, but that's what the law provides, that the annual meeting is, the date is picked by the board president. Regular meetings are required to be held at least once per month following the annual meeting. You can have additional regular meetings per month. Many of the larger districts have 2 regular meetings per month. And then special meetings. This is kind of really where I think a kind of major power of the board president comes into play. So the board president alone has the authority under North Dakota law to call a special meeting. Otherwise, it would take 2 board members to call a special meeting. So really what that means in reality is that the board president has a lot of power to dictate what issues come before the board. Because by simply calling a special meeting, that board president can determine what agenda items are discussed at a special meeting. That's basically what that means in practicality. So we always caution board presidents to really exercise that authority responsibly, and not use it as a means to pursue any kind of personal agenda or personal motivations. But you do have the authority alone as board president to call a special meeting. Looks like we have a couple of other questions. Okay. During a substitute teacher shortage, what are your thoughts on allowing board members to provide substitute teaching duties? It's a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking today, but I understand it's a common question. I get that question about employing board members in various capacities, especially when you can't find anybody else to fill the spots. And to fill the positions. So it's a very common question. It really depends. There are clear positions in North Dakota law where it's by law, the 2 positions are incompatible. So for example, you can't be a board member and also be employed as a teacher in the same district. You can't also be employed as an administrator and be a board member in the same district. But there is some, I think, question and room, a kind of a gray area in terms of other positions in the district. Substitute teacher is, I think, a really gray area. It really depends on what you mean by, or what the particular teacher will do. Are they going to just be filling in for one day if somebody's absent? And are they, how are they paid and how are they compensated? How much do they get any kind of regular benefits? That's really going to determine, I think, whether it's appropriate for a board member to be employed as a substitute teacher. So I guess, again, I give the lawyer answer as it depends. Next question, can the annual meeting in July also serve as the regular meeting for July? Yes, I think that's how most boards do that. Their annual meeting also serves as their regular meeting in July. The law requires that you hold your annual meeting in July and then a regular meeting once per month thereafter. That's what the law says. So the law does not require a regular meeting separate from the annual meeting in July. I think most boards just treat their annual meeting as their regular meeting in July. So they take care of any regular business that needs to be taken care of at that annual meeting. Good questions. Okay. Okay, so in addition to the power to call special meetings and bring issues in front of the board, board policy also assigns the responsibility to the board president to create and prepare the agenda. Now, our kind of 2 board policies that talk about this are the BBBA policy, which I've already mentioned. That's the policy that talks about officers of the board president, vice president, and the powers of the board president, which include preparation of the agenda for all board meetings. And then there's also policy BCAA, that is the I forget the, let me see what our title is, board meeting agenda and pre-meeting preparation policy. It's kind of a long title, but basically that reiterates that the board president is tasked with preparing the agenda for each meeting in consultation with the superintendent. Now, I know that in many districts throughout North Dakota, the way that it works is the superintendent kind of puts together the agenda, because the superintendent is the top employee of the district, is responsible for the day-to-day operations, and should know and will know the various issues that need to be addressed by the board and the timing of that. And so board presidents, I think for the most part, should be relying pretty heavily on their superintendent to kind of guide them in terms of what issues need to be on the meeting agenda, in the timing of that. But at the end of the day, the board, and we've been kind of hammering this a lot at NDSBA lately, the board really needs to maintain the authority and control over its own meetings. And you do that by the board president being responsible for creating the meeting agenda, as opposed to the superintendent having that authority. So making sure that your policies reflect that is important. And so again, the board president would prepare the meeting agenda in consultation with the superintendent. We also encourage board presidents to seek or to receive input from other board members regarding issues that they believe the board should address. Ultimately, however, the board president is the gatekeeper. And again, I would just stress that when you're picking your board president at your annual meetings, recognize and that person is going to have a lot of authority to dictate the issues that are before the board. And so making sure you pick somebody that you think will exercise that authority responsibly and in good faith. And then the other thing that the board president is going to be doing in terms of agenda is fielding requests to be added to the agenda. Now, these can come from, like I said, other board members or third parties, sometimes staff members, sometimes patrons and other community members, sometimes vendors that want to present information to the board. Your board policy, BCAA, should dictate how those requests are expected to be received. Typically a certain amount of time before the next meeting that they want to be on the agenda for, that they have to identify the topic. And then ultimately the board president is responsible for determining, okay, yes, we can add this person or this item to the agenda, or no, this is not an appropriate item to be added to the agenda. I do hope that board presidents aren't just allowing everybody and anybody that requests to be placed on the agenda. You don't have to allow that. I think that's not the best practice, because there might be someone that comes along that you're like, gosh, I really don't think that's an appropriate agenda topic. And so being mindful that you have the authority to decline those requests. And I think the one area where I see that come into play a lot is, when staff members want, or parents want to have an audience in front of the board, maybe because they are not satisfied with how administration is handling or responding to whatever the issue is or the situation, be really cautious to allow that audience, because you're probably or maybe circumventing the chain of command and maybe even specific policies and procedures that you've adopted. And so be very mindful that when you get those kinds of requests from staff or parents, that you're not, becoming involved at the time or in an issue that is not appropriate. So what if there is a conflict between the board president and the superintendent in terms of items that should be put on the agenda? This is, again, kind of echoing the issues that we've been seeing in a number of districts with, where the superintendent maybe has a little bit more practical responsibility in dictating the agenda for the board. What happens when the superintendent is really pushing for an agenda item and the board president feels like it's not appropriate? Again, ultimately, the board president should retain the authority on behalf of the board to determine what the meeting agenda should look like. Okay, one other question. What are your thoughts on having an agenda item which include public comment, allowing anyone to stand, provide their name and address, and then their comments within the board meeting live, so to speak? So I think this is really getting at what do we think about having a regular agenda item that includes public comment. So just as a general matter, the public does not have a right generally to speak at a board meeting. There are some caveats to that where, you're required as a board to hold a public hearing, like on your tax levy each year, on your long-term planning, your 3 to 5 year long-term planning. Those are you're required in those instances to get public input. So you have to allow the public to provide input in those types of situations. There might be some additional ones that beyond those, but those are going to be specific in the law. But outside of those specific instances, the public generally does not have a right to speak at your meetings. Now, if you provide public comment, which many boards do, most boards do, particularly on their regular meeting agendas, they'll provide a public comment period. But if you do that, which you can do, you have the discretion to do that as a board, we recommend that you limit public comment to items that are dealt with on the agenda for that particular meeting, and that you set parameters. So timing, and give them an amount of time to speak. And maybe you can even have them sign up in advance for public comment. That's been a practice in some other states as well. But I think it's it's kind of that question of, they don't have a right to speak, but you're also elected officials, and so you want to also be responsive to what your community thinks. And so that's one way to get input. But as I'm sure most of us have experienced over the last couple of years, public comment can get out of control really easily. That's another area where the board president is going to be tasked with maintaining order. And so I think if you're going to allow for public comment, you want to be careful and thoughtful about how you do that. Okay, moving on. So a couple of other pre-meeting procedures that the school board president is going to be tasked with making sure you understand and make sure that they're being followed. Making sure proper notice is being provided and that other open meetings requirements are being followed. Now, we typically rely on our business manager and even to some extent our superintendent to make sure that notice is being posted. Those individuals, particularly the business manager, is tasked with, carrying out the practical notice requirements. But at the end of the day, the board president needs to make sure that notice is being provided so that, that the agenda is being properly prepared and that notice is being provided when it needs to be provided and in the manner in which it needs to be provided. So kind of having that knowledge of what the procedures are and what the requirements are important. Also, open meetings requirements like making sure that if you're providing information to other board members prior to a meeting, that all board members understand that discussion should not be taking place outside of the meeting in violation of the open meetings requirements. The board president is tasked with making sure that the board as a whole is respecting those open meetings requirements. The other thing is making sure that the location of your meeting is adequate for the amount of public participation or public attendance that you're expecting for that particular meeting. For our regular meetings where, maybe we're just kind of handling regular business, our regular locations are probably adequate if they've always been adequate. But if you have an issue on the agenda that you expect a high turnout or that there's a high turnout of the public as possible, you may have to, change the location of your meeting. And so the board president kind of has to be mindful of that as well. Another issue that kind of comes up frequently is what happens if we have to reschedule a meeting, like a special meeting or even a regular meeting. Kind of the board president is tasked with determining if that's appropriate and then how to go about rescheduling those meetings, and then making sure that board members have the information they need in order to be prepared for the meeting. That's another responsibility, kind of oversight of the board president. The board president may not be the person actually providing that information, but you should be in regular communication with your business manager and your superintendent in particular, and making sure that you have the information in order to be properly prepared for an upcoming meeting, as well as your fellow board members as well. Jerry, thank you for the note. Our template policy BCBA covers public comment period and hopefully echoes the thoughts that I gave just a minute ago. So thank you for that reminder, Jerry. Okay, so for actual board meeting procedures, I took this list, and some of these I've already, the first several deal with pre-meeting procedures, but the majority of them deal with kind of all of the responsibilities that the board president has at each meeting, during the meeting. So calling meetings to order, recognizing board members that want to speak on a particular issue, limiting or extending the time of discussion or debate on a particular agenda item. That's going to be the task of the board president. Making sure that when an action or a motion is proposed, that is clearly stated so that it's clear what the board is voting on and what is being considered. So the board president is responsible for making sure that that's clear so that it can be adequately reflected in the meeting minutes, and frankly, so that the board knows everybody's on the same page, so it's clear what the board is voting on and taking action on. The board president will also generally announce the results of all votes. All votes that are non-procedural in nature, so anything on a substantive issue, the North Dakota law requires that they be done by roll call vote. So those votes will be announced in real time at the meeting, but the board president would be tasked with announcing what the results of all of those votes are, in addition to simply procedural votes as well. One of the big tasks is making sure that the agenda is being followed, that you're staying within the boundaries of the agenda and you're not getting off topic, and making sure that procedural rules are being followed, particularly Robert's Rules of Order. We'll talk about that in a second. Couple of the other ones, I'm not sure how often this happens, but it certainly comes up from time to time. If a board member or a member of the public or even a staff member is speaking out of turn or out of order, the board president is going to be tasked with the responsibility of returning order and alerting somebody when they are speaking out of order. That can be an uncomfortable and awkward responsibility, but it is something that you're going to need to be prepared to do as board president. Hopefully your fellow board members respect that. There's a reason we have meeting procedures. It's to keep order and to maintain order. And it's important as board members that we reflect respect for those rules, even when it's difficult, even when we feel like maybe we're not getting our fair shot to express our opinions and to engage in discussion. Because if you as board members don't respect those procedural rules, your public and your staff aren't going to respect them. And so it's important to be that example, even when it's difficult to do that. And when tensions are high, which happens and should be expected. All right, let me see here. Another one, recessing the meeting if necessary. I often get this. Almost always comes up in a situation where you're dealing with a contentious issue. Maybe there's a real heated discussion and disagreement amongst the board, or maybe the public is not maintaining order, maybe is calling out, speaking out, making noise, interrupting. That is where the board president has the power and should exercise it when necessary to recess the meeting until order is maintained. Sometimes even adjourning the meeting if that becomes necessary. If you cannot restore order, that's going to be a task of the board president. And that can be difficult because it can be a heated exchange and there can be, passionate discussion happening. And if it gets out of order and you can't establish order, recessing the meeting is a good tool to have in your toolbox to restore order. Okay. Another thing, the last one, review draft minutes with the business manager. I think it's always good to review those minutes with the business manager and not just leave that only to one set of eyes, because I think you avoid inadvertent errors if you have the board president also review the draft minutes with the business manager before they're approved by the board. So that's just kind of a list that we keep of the various responsibilities that the board president is going to have with respect to board meetings. Okay, moving on. Some additional things to keep in mind in terms of meeting procedures. The board president is responsible overall to ensure that the meetings are conducted professionally, orderly, and productively. So again, we kind of covered some of this in the previous slides, but that is a monumental task for a board president. It's a big ask. And so if your fellow board members choose you to be board president, I think, expecting that you're going to have to take on this responsibility and being ready for it, or being willing to be ready for it, is important. Looks like we have another question. Can the board president make a motion? I am going to address that here in 2 seconds, so that your timing is perfect. So I mentioned Robert's Rules of Order. So the law doesn't require, North Dakota law does not require that Robert's Rules of Order apply to school board meetings. Where that comes into play is by board policy, and specifically policy BCAB, if you have our template policies, that states that the board meetings will follow Robert's Rules of Order as a guide. And I italicized as a guide because I think there can be this tendency to focus so much on procedure that it interrupts the natural flow of a meeting. So you want to use Robert's Rules of Order as a guide to make sure that you can conduct orderly, professional, productive meetings. But you don't want to kind of have form over substance. You want to make sure that the strict adherence to the rules doesn't take precedence over conducting business and moving meetings along, so you're not there for hours on end. Okay. Board presidents, I want to be clear about this. Board presidents should be voting on all matters and motions and proposed actions that come before the board, unless there's a conflict of interest. So what that really means is a board president is just like any other board member when it comes to voting on proposed actions. The only time a board president shouldn't be acting or voting on a motion is if there's a conflict, and then under the law, and then you'd follow the conflict of interest procedures in order to allow for the board president to vote in those circumstances, just like you would any other board member who has a conflict. So I think there's this idea that there is this idea, and I've heard it several times from board members and administrators and business managers alike, that board presidents shouldn't be voting unless there's a tie. There is no such thing in North Dakota in that regard. There is no tiebreaker votes. If you do not obtain the necessary majority on a proposed action, the action fails. So if it results in a tie vote, let's say you have a 5-member board, one board member is absent, there's a proposed action and the vote is 2-2. The board president does not break the tie in that situation. There is no such thing as a tiebreaker. What happens in that instance is the motion or the action fails. period. Doesn't mean that the board can't take up that issue again at a future meeting or reconsider the issue, but in terms of that particular vote, once it results in a tie, that ends the proposed action. Okay, so what about the board president making motions and seconding motions? So nothing in Robert's Rules of Order or in North Dakota law prohibits board presidents from making motions and from seconding motions. And it, frankly, in my opinion, I don't think we should be overly restrictive of that in terms of board policy. Our template policy that addresses board president duties has optional language to restrict the board president from making motions and from seconding motions. I honestly don't think that I discourage, frankly, boards from adopting that optional language. And the reason for that is, you know, you should, as a board, you should be picking a board president that is going to exercise the authority of the president in that position responsibly. And so that means in some respect that they're not going to abuse their position. And so there shouldn't, if they are going to respect the position and exercise their authority in good faith and responsibly, there should be no reason to restrict them from making motions and from making seconds. However, having said that, even if you as a board president have the power to make a motion, I think you need to be careful that you are not exercising undue influence to guide the decisions and the direction of the board. So allow others to make motions, invite others to make motions on a particular issue before you make that motion. Doesn't mean you have to do that in every instance, but I think that's the responsible way to act as a board president. Invite once you've, an issue is before the board and it's ready for action, invite a motion from the board, and hopefully a board member will step up and make an appropriate motion. And it kind of goes for seconds as well. I think if you can provide the opportunity for another board member to second a motion, that's preferred. Because again, it kind of respects the power and the authority of the board president and making sure that there's not even this appearance that the board president is exercising any kind of undue influence. Okay, so that's my thoughts on motions and seconds by the board president. I don't know if that's controversial or not, but that's my thoughts on it. And this next point kind of echoes that. The board president should be guiding and facilitating discussion. That's your job as the board president, to make sure that issues are being fleshed out, being properly discussed as a board so that you can make informed decisions as a board. And so it's your responsibility as a board president to guide and facilitate discussion. That's not improper. However, you shouldn't be using that again to monopolize the discussion or to unduly influence the board's actions. So again, it's a balance. Let's see. Is it the board president responsibility to take roll call on motions, or is that part of the business manager's responsibility? Seems odd to call one's own name and vote. It's a good point. So the practice, the general practice, and frankly, the recommended practice is for the board president to call for a roll call vote and direct the business manager to call, to take a roll call. So that's typically how it is. It's not that the board president actually does the roll call vote. They direct the business manager to call the roll call, to call for a vote at the appropriate time. So it's really making sure that the meeting is proceeding in accordance with proper procedure. And then, like say, once the business manager goes through the roll call of the board, then typically the board president would be responsible for announcing the results. So, motion passes 3-2 or whatever it might be. Now, if the board business manager, if it's your practice that the business manager typically announces that, that's fine as well. I think the law isn't dictating exactly what you should do or need to do in that particular circumstance. Okay, what about executive sessions? I put this on here because this kind of gets back to what I was talking about in a previous slide about making sure that you follow open meetings requirements, that things are properly placed on the agenda. Executive sessions is kind of can be a minefield of open meetings violations. So making sure that if an executive session is anticipated or expected, it has to appear on the agenda. Regardless of it's a regular or special meeting, it has to appear on the agenda. Otherwise, you cannot go into executive session. Making sure that it's not only is it on the agenda as an agenda item, but that the legal authority for the executive session is listed particularly on the agenda. And then at the meeting, making sure that you're following proper procedure to go in and out of executive session. If an executive session is required by law, for example, if you're going to be discussing a confidential or closed record, oftentimes the executive session, in order to discuss it, is required. Sometimes an executive session is required when you are holding a due process hearing, for example. In those circumstances, a motion to go into executive session is likely not necessary. However, I know most boards just have a motion every time. But otherwise, if executive session is not required but is allowed, you have to have a motion to go into executive session. And so you want to make sure as board president that you are making sure that all of those procedures are being properly followed. And then moving in and out of executive session appropriately, making sure people that are attending and participating in the executive sessions should be participating in the executive sessions. With very few exceptions, the board gets to determine who participates in executive sessions. That includes your own administrative staff. If there's a reason your superintendent or your business manager shouldn't be in the executive session and listening to the discussion, the board has the authority to exclude that person from executive sessions. Making sure that all of the requirements in terms of recording the executive sessions is being followed is also ultimately responsibility of the board president in terms of the conduct of the meeting. And then also making sure generally that board members and those that are present in the executive session understand that anything discussed in executive session is confidential and should not be discussed outside of that executive session or shared with anybody else. So the board president should be making sure that everyone understands the rules in terms of executive session. Another responsibility is maintaining order. We've talked about this. Some of the things that I recommend, that we recommend as an association to help maintain order as a board and as board president, is to making sure that you're adopting and following a policy on public participation. I mentioned earlier that we do have a template policy on public participation. I would make sure that you're looking at what your policy says and making sure that your public participation works for your board, and you might want to make some changes to make it flow better and work better for you. But once, adopting a policy and a procedure and following it is highly recommended to help maintain order. Keeping the discussion focused on what's on the agenda. So again, it's a balance. You want to facilitate, as board president, you want to facilitate the discussion on the agenda items, encouraging board members, giving them opportunity to provide their input, but also making sure that you steer back when the discussion veers off topic or you're starting to go outside the items stated on the agenda. So it's a constant balance. You want to facilitate discussion, but also keep it focused on the agenda. Another big responsibility that I think is somewhat overlooked, or not necessarily overlooked, but I think we kind of feel like it feels weird as a board president, but you are responsible to build consensus. And that doesn't mean that you steer board members to vote a certain way on an issue, but it means you're facilitating discussion, making sure that everybody, all viewpoints are heard on the board, and then encouraging building consensus or building compromise if necessary to make the most informed decision in the best interest of the school and in best interest of your students. So building that consensus as a board president is important. And I mentioned this before, using parliamentary procedures as needed to maintain order, but don't allow it to become, strict adherence to those parliamentary procedures. Don't allow that to be more important than the meeting itself and the substantive discussion. So again, a balance being struck there as well. All right, a couple of questions. If the board president is aware of confidential information being shared outside of executive session, what do you recommend the board president do regarding this violation? If you as a board president become aware that somebody is sharing confidential information, I think don't ignore it. I think you need to address it and you need to address it promptly. It's I think possible that inadvertent disclosures can be made, but even if it's inadvertent, that should be addressed. And a lot of times what that's going to mean is just having a conversation with whoever the person is and making sure that they understand that, the law requires that information discussed in executive session be kept confidential and that there are criminal penalties attached with sharing confidential information. Another question, how can a board president guide a board member that has been left out of their committee's discussion or decision? For instance, in a 3-member committee, 2 members have made decisions and taken steps to implement those decisions without involving or informing the 3rd member. Great question. I'm not sure who this anonymous attendee is, but whoever's asking these questions, maybe it's not the same person. Great questions. So as I mentioned earlier, the board president is tasked by law and by board policy with appointing members to committees, ultimately subject to board approval. But in addition to that, or kind of related to that, if the board president becomes aware of a committee that is not operating appropriately, that maybe is doing something like this, where basically 2 members are shutting out a 3rd member, I think the board president absolutely has the authority and should address that issue. Sometimes it can be simply addressed by a conversation with the 2 committee members, probably not together to avoid open meetings violations, but having a conversation, reminding them that, the board appointed all 3 committee members, and just like in regular board meetings or meetings of the full board, it's important that the minority viewpoint be discussed and be allowed to be shared and considered before the board or the committee in this instance takes action. So sometimes just having that informal conversation is enough to help and resolve that situation. If that's not enough, you can take it to the full board, or even change committee membership. That can be done typically during, at any time. Great question. Another question, I know we're running low on time here. What if your board president is calling board members between meetings to discuss agenda items? Sorry. Okay, so I will say, we always have to be mindful of the open meetings boundaries in terms of how we can discuss board business or public business outside of meetings. You're not strictly prohibited from doing that. But, so for example, you can have one-on-one conversations with another board member. That in and of itself is not a problem. So if the board president wants to provide some information to board members or make them aware of an issue, there's typically nothing wrong with the board president reaching out and having that one-on-one conversation. When it becomes problematic is when you have what we call a rolling quorum. So if essentially your board president is going to each board member and essentially conducting a meeting, a discussion, amongst a quorum or more of members. And that becomes problematic when the board president goes to board member A and says, hey, I've got this issue, wanted to know your thoughts. And then goes to board member B and says, hey, board member B, got this issue, want to get your thoughts. Board member A, I talked to them, here's what they said. That's obviously problematic. And that can be kind of hard to know where the line is. And so we always caution board members to be very mindful of having those discussions one-on-one, even outside of a meeting. Your discussions should in large part be occurring at a board meeting, but sometimes those one-on-one discussions are helpful and necessary. So I guess I would just say, making sure all of your board members understand where the boundaries are and understand what the open meetings requirements are. And then if you become aware of a potential violation, or making sure you don't ignore it and discuss that, maybe have that conversation with the individual board member. All right, good questions. I just want to mention before we end for the day, the importance of communication with your administration. That is a key function of the school board president. You are essentially acting as a liaison between the board and administration, and particularly between the board and your two direct employees, superintendent and business manager. And so there's going to be ongoing communication between the board president and the superintendent and or the business manager. That is expected. That should be happening. If that's not happening, I think that could be a sign that maybe things aren't functioning appropriately, or maybe there's just not a well-developed working relationship. That takes time to build that, but that should be a goal for all board presidents. Board presidents should be receiving reports as needed on the day-to-day operations from your superintendent. And really what this is meant to get is, I had mentioned early on in today's discussion that the board president should be available as counsel to the superintendent. And what that means is being a sounding board for the superintendent to kind of get a little bit of feedback on what the board's position might be on a particular issue happening at the district. You'll want to be careful. Sometimes maintaining separation is important, especially when we're talking about personnel matters in particular, or student discipline issues, student records. You want to make sure that you're not necessarily sharing that or receiving that information as a board president when you shouldn't be. But, again, being a sounding board, being there as counsel for and to provide some feedback to your superintendent is a big part of being superintendent or being board president. Again, meeting prior to each meeting with your superintendent and your business manager in some cases, to not only prepare, but to also discuss the agenda items, making sure that, superintendent administration is on the same page as the board president so that there's not miscommunication, there's not misunderstandings that can result. So not just meeting to prepare the agenda, but also to discuss the actual items on the agenda with your administration so that you are properly prepared for the upcoming meeting. Another big task of a board president, and one I receive a lot of calls on, is handling of complaints filed or made against your superintendent and or business manager. That is typically dictated by policy. There are a number of policies that follow that chain of command. Anytime there's a concern or complaint about your superintendent or business manager, typically the board president is going to handle that. And by handling, I mean gather information, maybe do an investigation, review what the complaint is, determine, okay, do we need to do anything else? Do we need to respond? Ultimately, if a corrective action or a response is needed, discipline is recommended, the board president doesn't make that decision on their own. They make a recommendation to the full board and get their approval, even if it's to you know, put a written reprimand or put something in the employee's file. That should be a decision that the board makes as a whole, not just the board president. And then another big responsibility of the board president is to coordinate and timely complete the superintendent evaluation process. We have a policy in a template policy that addresses superintendent evaluation, and it outlines specifically what the board president's responsibilities are, passing out the individual evaluations to board members, collecting those, making sure that they're done timely, and then compiling a document for the board to then discuss and approve at a subsequent meeting, and making sure that those are done in accordance with the timelines set forth in North Dakota law. Let's see. Question, there's a couple of questions that if we have time, we'll get back to them, but I'm just going to move on to my last thing. And it's really quick. I'm not going to go into too much about managing conflict, but I just wanted to address it because the board president is going to be tasked with managing conflict in a number of different areas. But I guess I just wanted to, I think it's helpful to remember this, that conflict occurs naturally. Anytime you have a group of people working together, whether that be in the workplace or on a school board, conflict is natural. And so it is not always bad. It can fuel great discussion and debate. It can, you know, make board members aware of other viewpoints, and it can make decisions of the board better informed and better reflective of the community. So conflict is a good thing to a certain extent. It's destructive conflict that's problematic. And that is what really needs to be managed by the school board president in large part. I guess if I can send one message regarding managing conflict, today would be not to ignore it. Try to catch it early if you can, because I think when it's exacerbated or it's kind of stewing for a while, it can be more difficult to manage. So not ignoring destructive conflict or the potentially destructive conflict when you recognize it. The conflict can be amongst the board itself, or you can have conflict that arises between other parties, the board and administration, administration and personnel, patrons and the district. I mean, it can arise in a number of different areas. And the school board president, in terms of the board's role in managing those conflicts, it's the school board president that's going to be tasked with kind of handling and managing that for the most part. In terms of conflicts amongst the board, I just wanted to mention a few things. Again, building consensus is an important part of the school board president's job. And the way to do that, to avoid conflict or to deal with issues that cause conflict on the board, is to make sure that you're doing it with sound data and information. So making sure that you have all of the information that you need as a board to engage in really good discussion and debate before you make that decision. So making sure that data and information is available, you know, from the resources that you have, your superintendent, your business manager, whatever else you need. And then making sure that you have robust discussion and debate, encouraging that, while also maintaining order, while also not veering off topic. Again, that balance is important. And then ultimately making the most informed decision that's in the best interest of your district and your students. That's the idea. That's what I mean by building consensus. That goes a long way to either avoid conflict altogether or to make it manageable. Don't ignore the minority viewpoint. I kind of mentioned this in response to that committee question. It's important to not completely ignore the minority viewpoint. They should be heard and considered just as a majority viewpoint would be. Ultimately, once the board takes action, the majority decision of the board should be respected by all, but that does not mean shutting out the viewpoint altogether, the minority viewpoint altogether. That minority viewpoint should be heard and considered as well. And then again, making sure that all board members have the opportunity to express their opinions and be heard on issues before the board. That does not mean that the board members should be required to speak on everything, but they have the opportunity to express their opinions as those issues come up. I'm not going to go through this, but I just included some basic steps to managing conflict. This applies not only to managing conflict among board members, but also conflicts with superintendents, administration, patrons, community members, what have you. I'll just leave this for you to read at a later date. And then I just wanted to mention a couple of other considerations. In the absence of the school board president, so maybe the school board president is out of town or is sick or whatever the case may be, they're absent from the meeting, the vice president may preside over the meetings or a portion of the meeting if it's inappropriate or if the board president is unavailable for a portion. That is reflected in law. It's also reflected in board policy. What happens if the board president has a conflict of interest? Again, I mentioned this before. It doesn't mean that the board president should just sit out entirely. In terms of dealing with the conflict of interest, there's kind of two things to consider. Presiding over the meeting or the agenda item in particular, and actually participating in the discussion and vote. Those are kind of two different considerations when it comes to the board president. In terms of when the board president has a conflict under the law, you would follow the same procedure that you would ordinarily do when a conflict arises with the board member. I encourage giving consent even when there's a conflict. In most circumstances, there are some caveats to that, but most of the time when a board member has a conflict, if you follow proper procedure, I would encourage the other board members to allow for that board member to participate in the discussion and vote. Same would go for the board president with a conflict. However, you might need to consider whether the board president with the conflict, even if you consent to their participation, whether they should preside over the meeting when that particular issue is being discussed. Does it make sense to have the vice president preside over the meeting for the period of time under which that or when that issue is being discussed? Again, it kind of reflects transparency. It avoids any appearance of impropriety. It's not something you're required to do once the conflict is kind of cleared up, but it's something to consider. If a board president has a conflict, should they be presiding over that issue, even if they're allowed to participate in the discussion and vote? And then what about instances where there is no legal conflict of interest, but there's something that exists in the situation that maybe the board president has a little bit more involvement or knowledge in? Do you have the board president preside over that issue, that agenda item? That's something I think to consider. And I think the board president, first and foremost, should be aware of that and maybe asking the board if somebody else should preside over that particular item, just to avoid that appearance of impropriety. And then finally, removal from office. I just wanted to mention that policy BBBA does contain a removal procedure for all board officers, including the board president. Typically, all that is necessary is a majority vote of the board to remove an officer, including the school board president, from that position. And that can really be done for any kind of negative conduct, maybe some kind of malfeasance in office, if they've engaged in criminal, some kind of criminal behavior that maybe doesn't rise to the level of a felony, or, maybe they've just engaged in some other negative conduct that calls into question their ability and the appropriateness of them serving as board president. There is a process to remove them from office. Another helpful thing to have before even maybe you get to the removal stage is to have an ethics policy. We have a sample policy BA that contains board ethics. That policy not only contains ethical standards, but also some kind of consequences if you violate certain standards. The board can't remove one of its own, but there are some suggestions in that policy on things that you can do in response to violations of that ethics policy. So sometimes that will also keep a board president in line, so to speak. Okay, I know I went way over and I appreciate your patience. We do have a couple of questions. I'm just going to look here to see if I can answer them really quickly. Okay, let's see. If the board president recommends a formal written reprimand that isn't necessarily related to a complaint against the superintendent, but rather a violation of district policy witnessed by the board president, should that be acted upon by the board, or can the board president issue that without board action? Great question. If you have our template policies, a board president typically is going to have the authority to take disciplinary action, formal disciplinary action against the superintendent on their own. They're going to need the board approval to do that. Discipline can come and be issued even in the absence of a formal complaint. If the board becomes aware of a violation of policy by the superintendent, it's absolutely within the purview of the board to consider discipline on that violation without having some kind of formal complaint. Even if there's a concern raised by a third party or about your superintendent or maybe your business manager, but that party is not willing to put that in a written complaint and follow a formal policy procedure, that also doesn't strictly prohibit the board from taking any action. It might limit what the board can do depending on the situation, but the board does have, they supervise the superintendent and the business manager. That includes if you become aware of a concern, even if it's not a result of a formal complaint, that does not necessarily mean you can't do anything. And I would encourage you to consider taking action, some sort of action to address those concerns as they come up. How about if your findings are not to issue some kind of corrective action and the person filing the complaint disagrees? What is their resource or next step? So I would assume if you're saying you mean a board president. So if the board, again, the board president typically does not have the ability to decide on their own what the corrective action would be. That would be something that would go in front of the full board and the board would take action. If somebody disagrees with a school board's decision, they kind of have two routes. They can ask the board to reconsider their decision and the board can decide whether it wants to do that or not, or there is the ability to challenge a local governing body decision like a school board by filing a lawsuit in district court. That's the next step. It has to be an aggrieved party that has the standing to sue the district on to challenge a decision. But that's kind of the other possibility on that as well. Great questions. I think we're going to stop at there. I apologize. I didn't get to all of the questions, but feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions on anything we discussed today. I just want to remind you or let you know that we are working on a school board president's handbook. We want to have that done before July so that our new board presidents have it to use for starting in July for their new term. So stay tuned for that. And then also, please be aware that our next Lunch and Learn is going to be on June 15th. Again, we're going to hold it at 9 a.m. I think this was a good turnout at 9 a.m. So we're going to try it again. It's going to be regarding School Finance 101, which I think everyone can use a refresher as often as possible. And our, kind of regular finance guru, Paul Stremick, is going to be the one providing that information. So go to our website under the resources tab to get more information on that and to register. Thank you guys so much for your attention and your time today. We really appreciate it. Again, please reach out for any additional resources or questions. Thank you so much and have a